How y'all doing? My name is Kanoki Dave. I own Kanoki Foods, and I'm the director of US Matter Incorporated here in Hamilton, Ontario. What you're about to watch is a seminar of Tim Fletcher. He's a counselor who's he runs REACT centers across Canada. He lives in Windsor. He drove up to Hamilton, which is about a 3-hour drive, to explain complex trauma and the different approaches that REACT uses to help people with complex trauma and addictions. The seminar was about 3 hours. We didn't get it all. We did have technical difficulties, but everything we got, we edited, and this is what you're about to watch. I would like to thank everybody who did attend. I would like to thank Tim Fletcher for coming up, thank Philpott Church for hosting it with us, and thank Second Chance Meals for catering it for us. And I hope you were able to get something out of this. Here in Hamilton, we plan on starting one of the programs called En Route that Tim Fletcher's organization does. That is a low barrier drop-in that will help people ignite the stages of change and understand their trauma, but it's a low barrier, so you don't have to be sober yet to do these drop-ins, but it'll help get towards that want for change and the support we will help you with for that change. And we eventually want to have the REACT Center, which is actually like an outpatient rehab that you come to 5 days a week, and you learn with teachers who are trained through all this trauma and all this complex trauma and addictions work to support you as we build you a community here in Hamilton. So once again, or if you never have, you can thrive with the potential that you have. Thank you, and I hope that you get something out of this video.
Well, I got to tell you up front that what I'm going to try to teach you today is what I usually take about 80 hours to teach. So you're going to be drinking out of a fire hose, basically, is what you're going to get. We're not going to get the whole movie, you're going to get the trailer, basically, of what complex trauma is. So just to give you a little bit of, I started in this field, I came out of pastoral work, I became very ill, had to leave that, and then ended up 20 years ago in this field. At that point in time, there was almost zero understanding around trauma. But I had the privilege of working in the only addiction treatment center in Canada, and it was in Winnipeg, that had a different mindset around addiction. And their mindset is addiction is actually a symptom of deeper problems. It's not the main problem, it's just a symptom. And what they then said was, for most people that begin using drugs and alcohol, addiction was the solution to their problems. They saw it as the way to get out of their pain, the way to not have to deal with some of this painful stuff. So they didn't see it as a problem, they saw it as a solution. And so that's really become the mindset in understanding trauma. And so the addiction treatment center that I worked in was actually leading the way in saying, what are these deeper problems? And we didn't have the words trauma at that point, but we were heading in that direction. And so I had the privilege, really, of working and researching what are the deeper problems that set people up to want to use drugs to solve those problems. And then Dr. Gabor-Mate came out from Vancouver, and he worked on East Hastings Street, and he said, 100% of the people that I work with who are addicts have childhood trauma. And that was bing in my mind, I think that explains it. And so since then, the research says 97% of addicts are doing it to solve their childhood trauma. It's their solution to the childhood trauma. So the root issue is trauma. What Dr. Gabor-Mate has also done is to say, if you look at a lot of the mental health diseases or mental health issues like ADHD, there's a really high probability that it's coming out of trauma. So the child can't focus at school because they're too worried about what's been going on at home, what happened last night. So they have a difficulty being present because all the trauma, danger experiences are keeping them distracted. And so he wrote a book around that, and that's become more and more accepted. There's still resistance. Then Bruce Perry, Dr. Bruce Perry out of the States, he's probably, I would say, the leading, one of the best researchers on childhood trauma, spent 40 years. He's just written a book with Oprah called What Happened to You? And basically what he says is this: our whole approach in the medical world has been on the symptoms. So a person is homeless, a person is in jail, a person just lost their children to Children's Aid Society. Let's fix the symptoms, but let's judge them as we're doing that. And so instead of saying, what's wrong with you? He said, why don't we say, what happened to you? Because you're acting out of some pain. And so he began to create this model, which is to me excellent, that just gelled with my thinking with Gabor Mate, and that is, we have to change the way we work with people. We still got to work with symptoms, yes. But if we don't ever get to helping them with the root causes, we're never truly going to help them if we just work with symptoms. And so our whole governmental social services, our whole addiction models, our whole medical model is now out of date because it's all focused on symptoms only. But there's a gradual change beginning to happen, which says, let's get back to the root. And what we're going to find is, in most cases, there's a trauma component that's never been understood, never been dealt with. So what I've spent the last 20 years doing is researching, developing, understanding, not simple trauma, and that's what most of us think when we think of trauma. So simple trauma is a one-time event. So a car accident, a rape, it's horrific, it's terrible, but what sets people up for addiction is not necessarily the one-time events, though it can. It's what happens when a child lives in constant danger. Not just one-time danger, but they're in an environment of danger. That's the problem. And so that has become known as complex trauma or complex PTSD. And so that's what I spent the last 20 years researching, teaching. We started a treatment center 5 years ago, 6 years ago now. It is now spread to different treatment centers around Canada. When COVID came, we put stuff online, and that now has spread around the world. So we now have over 100 people all around the world taking our treatment programs for trauma. And so what's come out of that is just all of this material to really help people understand the finer points of complex trauma. And that's what I want to give you today. So there's lots of information on simple trauma and PTSD. There's not much information on complex trauma and complex PTSD. And that's, to me, and I'm going to show you in a little bit, that's what we need to understand badly. So, I love this quote from Desmond Tutu. It says, there comes a point when we need to stop pulling people out of the river. So what's our approach? Oh, there's a homeless person, let's pull them out of the river. There's somebody in jail, let's pull them out of the river. There's a drug addict, let's pull them out of the river. He says, we need to move upstream and find out why they're falling in the first place. And that's what the study of complex trauma is. Why are they falling in the river in the first place? If we can stop them from falling in the river, then we never have to pull them out. And that would save us billions of dollars if we were able to begin to do that better. So just let me give you some stats right now. And so Dr. Bruce Perry in his book cites this research. So I said 97% of people with addiction have complex PTSD. What they're now finding is over 90% of people in prison have complex trauma. Over 90% of homeless people, so people up front, complex trauma. Over 90% of people who lose their children to CAS, they have their own complex trauma. When you get to self-harm behaviors, cutting, you get the eating disorders, over 90% complex trauma. Starting to see a theme? So all the stuff we're dealing with, these symptoms, and these are the crises of our society, they're now saying they all have something in common. They're trying to deal with a childhood trauma. So you take any social service we have, you can have a good probability that over 90% of the people that use that social service have complex trauma. Family violence, complex trauma. And then, to me, a really important one is when you look at the disorders. So the mental health world, the disorders, so you got borderline personality disorder, attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, so narcissistic personality disorder, disorders. Basically what they're finding out is those are ways of coping with trauma. And so again, it's a trauma root that is behind much of mental health issues. And people with complex trauma, 100% of people with complex trauma have depression and anxiety issues. It's just a given. And so if you have complex trauma, you're going to have some mental health issues. That's a given. And I'll explain all of that as we go. But I love this quote by a renowned traumatologist, John Briere. If complex PTSD were given its due, that is, if the role of dysfunctional parenting in adult psychological disorders was ever recognized, the DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual, would shrink to the size of a thin pamphlet. And I would wholeheartedly agree. Here's what the latest research that we're finding. So the cost of cancer to our society, $216 billion. Cost of diabetes, $245 billion. Heart disease, $313. Guess what the cost of trauma now is? $671 billion. So nothing is costing our society more than trauma. But what is the least talked about up till a few years ago? Trauma. It was unrecognized. It was not considered significant. We just figured people coming back from war had PTSD, so we just need to help them. And so there's a very gradual, but it's happening, increasing awareness that this is a big, big issue. And so that's really what I want to try to impress you with. Now, I have to add this, because I personally struggle with the word trauma, because for most of us, we make assumptions when we hear that word. And so when we hear trauma, we think of something horrific. And so for an audience like you, I suspect some of you are going, oh, nothing horrific happened to me, so I guess I don't have any trauma. So I'm here at this seminar to learn how to help others. So what I want to do is, trauma in itself PTSD ends up with about 10 characteristics. Okay, but when a child is in constant danger, guess how many characteristics they end up with? 60 characteristics of maladaptive behaviors. So one-time trauma affects you with 10 maladaptive behaviors. Ongoing danger for a child, 6 times more dangerous. Now, what happens if you grew up in a home that was fairly healthy, but there was a few things unhealthy? You end up with 20, 30 characteristics. That's still worse than the person with one-time trauma. Now that's hard to accept, because you go, I don't want to say anything bad about my family. I don't want to blame my parents, but I'm not trying to blame anybody. I want you to understand how the events of your upbringing shaped you. And what happens when you face childhood trauma, and I'm going to explain all of that in a bit, is you have to adapt. You have to adapt to try to get your needs met. You have to adapt to try to not get hurt again. Adapt to survive. And what comes out of that is that adaptation kept you safe. But let me give you one of the adaptations. Don't trust anybody. Wear masks. Learn to manipulate people. That's how a child will adapt. That kept them safe. Now, you get to be an adult and you want to have a relationship and you live by those same adaptations, don't trust anybody, wear masks, and manipulate. How's your relationship going to go? Not well. So the adaptations that kept you safe mess up adult life. And so what a lot of my work has been around is looking at the subtle forms of complex trauma. So people with lots of healthy in their upbringing, but a bit of unhealthy. So here are a few of the characteristics of complex trauma. I'm going to go through them very quickly, and you can check off how many apply to you, and we'll see if you need to be in this seminar, okay? So self-esteem issues, depression issues, anxiety issues, ADHD, borderline personality issues, and what that means is you're cool as a cucumber 95% of the time, but if somebody triggers your rejection, abandonment, anger, whoop, you're a different person. And you can go crazy. Anger issues, trust issues, don't trust or do well with authority, wear masks, don't know who you are, for sure, perfectionist, a people pleaser, have trouble saying no to people, have boundaries struggles, have control issues, manipulation. You long for intimacy, but you're afraid of intimacy. You gain value by doing. You don't feel you have any value just because you're you. You got to perform in order to have any sense of value. So you're a human doer, not a human being. Hypersensitive to disrespect, hypersensitive to criticism, tend to go quite negative and critical in your mind. Impulsive, easily dissociate or escape to fantasy worlds, or not have trouble being present to other people. Trouble regulating your emotions, tend to stuff your emotions. You always have to need a distraction. You can't sit and just be quiet. You need something to be doing on your phone or whatever. A fear of change, a fear of the unknown, a fear of abandonment, fear of failure, fear of conflict, fear of being a burden, and when things are going well, you tend to sabotage them. Don't do well with stress, great starter, poor finisher. So that's about 30 of the 60 characteristics. How did you do? So you might need to be in this seminar. So what I'm going to try to show you is you say, but I came from a fairly healthy home. Yeah, but if you got a few things that made you not feel safe or where your needs weren't met very well and you didn't get good tools, you had to resort to bad tools. And that doesn't seem to be an issue in your childhood. It doesn't hit you till you get into adult life and you face the stresses and responsibilities of adult life. Then that exposes all your bad tools. That exposes all of the stuff that wasn't dealt with properly. And so it comes out later in your relationships, in your job. And so that becomes such an important part in understanding trauma, is there's degrees of trauma. There's severe, but there's mild. And mild still can have a very negative effect on people. Okay, so let me begin with understanding trauma. So there's the event, but that in itself isn't necessarily traumatizing. It's a horrific event. What makes the trauma is the experience of the person, the second thing. Do they have the tools to handle it? Do they have the supports they need to handle it? And so Gabor Mate said, trauma isn't what happens to you. That would be a traumatic event. Trauma is what happens inside of you because of what happened to you. And so if you can't cope with that event because you don't have the tools or supports, then that affects you negatively and it forces you to go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, are the 4 F's that we use for how do you handle a traumatic event when you don't have tools or support to deal with it properly. Your only recourse is to go into survival mode, which is fight, flight. And if you're too little to fight or flight, then you have to go into freeze or learn to fawn. And that is learn to people please. Learn to try to make people like you so they won't hurt you again. So PTSD versus cptsd, just to give you that very briefly, and I've alluded to it, so, effects, go to PTSD. So PTSD, one-time event, we call it simple trauma, and simple doesn't mean no big deal. Simple means from math, simple number is a 1 number. Okay, so one-time event trauma. Complex comes from math, so instead of a simple number, it's a lot of numbers. It happens over and over again. So what we know with simple trauma is the brain responds by the stress system is activated, and that releases cortisol and adrenaline in the brain and in the body. That sends out extra blood and sugar to the muscles so that you can fight or flight. That is the response to big T trauma. And if you can't do that, what the brain does is actually say you can't fight or flight, so I will stop the cortisol, I will stop the adrenaline, I will release opioids in the blood. So I'm going to prepare you for pain. And I'm going to prepare you to survive hurt because you can't fight or flight. And so that's what happens with big T trauma. That's what happens with trauma. And so then when opioids are released, then the blood goes all towards the heart. And basically what it's saying there is if you get cut in your extremities, you're not going to bleed as badly because I'm going to pool all the blood around the heart and really focus on just surviving. And so that's the response of the body to trauma. But then you have all the after effects, and that's the PTSD part. So now you're hyper vigilant. Now when that memory gets triggered, you don't regulate your emotions, you just lose it. So you hear a car backfire and it sounds like a gun going off and you just jump. And then you go and roll underneath a bush in order to hide. Then you become increasingly unable to handle distressful emotions, any stress, because that makes you think, oh, something bad's going to happen. I don't like this. I don't like this. This is uncomfortable. I want to get out of here. And so what you have with PTSD is a set of characteristics that come out of that one-time event. And I said there's about 10 characteristics, and there's lots of information on that. Some of the ongoing ones are flashbacks and nightmares and memories. You tend to avoid certain places and things now because you don't want to re-trigger that. Trouble sleeping and concentrating, hypervigilance, mood swings, depression and anxiety. And then you get different things that trigger those memories, which trigger those responses. So that's PTSD. We're very familiar with that. It's terrible, it's horrific. But then there's cptsd, and we're not so familiar. So the bottom line is this. There's 2 ways a child can receive cptsd, or even an adult. So the number one is, so cptsd again is complex or ongoing. So an ongoing environment of danger is the point. So that can be, the child gets big T trauma every day. Dad comes home drunk every day, dad beats up mom, dad beats up the kids, there's yelling, there's throwing things, there's a bully at school, there's a war going on, but every day there is big T trauma happening. And that can be sexual abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse. And so that you can see, that's traumatic. And so a lot of the people I deal with have complex trauma that's made up mainly of ongoing big T trauma. And their stories are so heartbreaking. But what we found out is a child can also feel in danger through neglect. Nobody's getting hurt physically. There's no danger physically, but nobody cares about your little world. Nobody's taking care of your emotional needs. Your physical needs are getting met, but your emotional needs aren't getting met. Dad's in the same room as you, but he's not present to you. He's not available to you. So you feel all alone. You feel it's me against the big bad world, and that's scary. And so what we're finding is neglect creates the same fear in child as big T trauma does. Because now I feel all alone to deal with my pain, to deal with the problems of the world. Nobody's giving me tools, nobody's giving me support, nobody's meeting my needs. And that has the exact same effect as all that big T trauma. Now people go, wow, are you sure about that? So they've actually done brain scans, and Bruce Perry and Gabor Mate both refer to these, and they show actually the brains of children with big T trauma versus neglect trauma and a healthy child growing up in a healthy home. The healthy child's brain develops normally and all the parts are developing well. Big T trauma and neglect trauma, parts of the brain aren't developed at all. And they look very similar. And so what we're going to look at in the second part is just how trauma affects the brain, which is fascinating. But just to understand at this point is complex trauma doesn't just have to have traumatic type events. Neglect is even bigger part. And I would say in Western cultures where we're all about productivity and getting ahead and success, this is the new kind of trauma, neglect trauma. And we have not been aware of that and the damage that it's done. So here's the challenge with trauma, with complex trauma. You see, if a child faced a problem that was scary, they would go one-time trauma and they would fight flight. But if they had parents who then come along and say, hey, here's what you could do next time this happens, and they give them tools and encouragement, the next time it happens, they can now resolve that problem. So it's no longer traumatic to them because now got a resolution. They have tools and support. But what happens to a child who's living in a home where dad's yelling every day, dad's getting drunk every day, they're going to bed hungry, they're never being told they're loved, they're not being accepted, they're being made fun of and teased all the time and criticized all the time. They try to resolve that. They try to fix it, but it doesn't get resolved. There's nothing they can do to resolve it. And so what complex trauma basically ends up being is a child in problems that can't be resolved. So when you can't resolve a problem, it remains a problem. And it remains scary, it remains overwhelming, it remains dangerous to the child. So what we're going to see is in a complex trauma family, a child's needs aren't met properly, and they can't resolve that. They try to get their needs met, but nobody's meeting them. So they live with these unmet needs. So what do you then have to do? You adapt. So if nobody's going to love me for being authentic and nobody's going to want to connect with me for being authentic, well then what do I do? Because I still want to connect and I still want to be loved. Well, I'll adapt. I'll wear masks. They do it every day. And so it moves into your subconscious brain programming on how to live and how to respond in situations, because this is what you've created all the brain circuits, and this situation do this, and this situation do this, and they're all maladaptive adaptations to having unresolved problems in your life. So, cptsd, you got the adaptations that take place, but man, you've got all kinds of other things that happen. So in one-time trauma, you get the release of cortisol and adrenaline. That gives you the energy to fight or flight. As soon as you're out of the danger, the cortisol stops and the adrenaline stops. And you go back to a calm nervous system, a relaxed nervous system. But what happens when you're in danger every day? Well, you got cortisol pumping every day. You got adrenaline pumping every day. And guess what happens when you have cortisol and adrenaline pumping every day? It messes up your brain and your body, because your brain and body weren't designed to have cortisol pumping every day. They were designed to have it happen very rarely. And so what we're finding, and Gabor Mate's done tremendous work on this, and Bessel van der Kolk, is that when you have cortisol pumping every day, which is what's happening in complex trauma, that's what sets you up for heart disease, that's what sets you up for diabetes, that's what sets you up for all kinds of autoimmune diseases, lupus, etc. All of those now are going back to too much cortisol that was suppressed. And so what is kind of a scary realization is what they're now saying is that over 90% of diseases that we treat in the West come out of stress-related issues in childhood regarding cortisol and adrenaline. Scary stuff, but that's the reality of what they're finding. So then you have two systems in your body called your sympathetic nervous system and your parasympathetic, which is your central nervous system that regulates everything. So your sympathetic nervous system is your energy system and your survival system. So that's where you get energy to go to work, to run, to do stuff. And then your parasympathetic nervous system, it kicks in to help you rest, to rejuvenate, to get back to a balance so that you can continue every day to go to work and not burn out. So we're set up with a nervous system that has to be in balance if we're going to be healthy. Sympathetic, parasympathetic, they balance, they're equal. What happens in complex trauma? Your sympathetic has to work all the time because you're always in danger. You're always in survival mode. Your parasympathetic can never kick in. So it just has to stay dormant. Well, what happens with you got a sympathetic nervous system going all the time? You eventually burn out. Because you run out of cortisol energy, your body starts breaking down, and so you burn out. And so that's why some people go to addiction. Because it gives them a break, gives them a holiday, lets them relax for a while. And so that becomes a solution to that. And so part of what is so tragic to me is complex trauma sets a child up to have their nervous system way out of balance, but that feels normal to them. So here's what begins to happen when they get into recovery. Their normal is chaos all the time. That feels normal, that feels right. Now you say you need a disciplined, routine, structured life, and you need to get your parasympathetic back into balance. Well, that feels boring. That feels like a waste of time. That feels dead. And so everybody that's trying to get back to healthy from what was their unhealthy normal, at first it's just weird, it feels wrong, it just, this is dumb. And it's really difficult. And so they have to go through a transition of getting to this healthy normal that goes against everything in them that it just feels so weird and wrong. But complex trauma does huge damage in messing your nervous system up. Okay, and then the next thing that it does is the child begins to believe a set of lies that they think are the truth. So if dad never wants to spend time with me, what does the child conclude? Must be my fault. Must be something wrong with me. If dad hits me all the time, must be my fault. Must be wrong with me. And so they begin to believe I'm bad. I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable, I guess. So their identity now becomes controlled by lies. But to them, they seem like the truth. It's their experience. Dad doesn't want to spend time with me. That makes sense. But now they go to their next relationship and they believe that lie. And what they believe is, as soon as you get to know me, you're going to leave me like dad did. So I better wear my mask so that you don't ever get to find the real me. And so it sets them up to be incapable of that because they're operating on lies. And then every child comes in with the instinct of being authentic. Children are just who they are. They're out there. What you see is what you get. But what happens if they're authentic and then they're judged for that? They're punished for that. Or you're too weak. You shouldn't be crying so much. You shouldn't be sad. Put a smile on your face. Go to your room. Don't come out till you got something to be happy about. All of those rules get put into place. And then when they're out there, people don't want to connect with them. So what they begin to realize, or what they begin to believe, is authenticity equals rejection. Really, the truth is authenticity with safe people leads to intimacy. But in their world, when there's no safe people and they don't realize it, authenticity equals rejection. So now you go into adult life with that belief system and you set yourself up to fail. And so what comes out of complex trauma is a web of lies that are core beliefs that most people aren't even aware of. So let me just give you that core belief of I'm not lovable or I'm not good enough, okay? So if I was to go to the average person that I worked with and I said, I was watching you today in class and watching you interact with other clients, you got a gift. What would go on in their brain? He doesn't mean that. He's just saying that to be nice. Or, wonder what he wants. He's playing me. He's trying to manipulate me. So they couldn't accept the truth because of that core lie. And so part of what we deal with in helping people is every core lie has defense after defense after defense that we have to get through gradually before they'll ever change the core lie. And so those lies are very, very difficult to get through. Okay, I want to just take this to the last bit before we do a break, and that is to look at this meeting of needs thing, okay? Because this to me becomes a core piece in understanding the more subtle types of complex trauma. So what we're basically going to realize is we're all created with 12 basic needs. And those include physical needs, relational needs, emotional needs, spiritual needs, okay? And so every parent, to be a good parent, has to learn to meet all those needs in their child and teach the child how to meet those needs in yourself. We don't consider a good parent one that just meets physical needs only. They need to meet their emotional needs, their intellectual needs, their relational needs, all of those other needs in order to be a good parent. Why I'm going to tell you this is there's been different approaches to helping people who are homeless and addiction and all of that. And it basically has been, let's go one need only. And so you'll get Christians that say, let's just meet their spiritual need and they'll be fixed. And I go, no, we're more than just spiritual need people. Or others, let's just meet their physical needs and that should be good enough. No, we're more than that. So what we're going to see is to help people with complex trauma, it's biopsychosocial spiritual. We got to meet all their needs. So another way to look at it is this. A person come out of complex trauma didn't get perfect parenting. None of us did. But complex trauma, you got either terrible parenting or moderate parenting. But the bottom line is you didn't get tools to meet your basic needs. And your basic needs weren't met very well. So part of recovery then for people is what I call, and is what is becoming known as, we reparent people. They didn't get a good job the first time, so now we reparent them. And part of reparenting them is we teach them all the tools for a healthy life. And that can be from tying your shoe to doing a budget to how to change a baby's diaper to taking care of your own physical needs, your own emotional needs. There's thousands of needs that have to be met. And so if I had a little child who was learning to ride a bike and I went up to them when they fell off and they're crying and I said to them, you just need Jesus and to read your Bible, get back on your bike, you go, that's not good parenting. They need to be taught how to ride a bike. That's a practical tool. And so what we realize is there's tons of tools that are involved in parenting. And so to help a person with trauma, which is reparenting, I got to teach them tons of tools. With some clients, super basic practical ones. Others, they just need more sophisticated ones. So anyways, that's where we're going. So the first need is our brain is wired for pleasure. So what they've found out is our brain basically secretes chemicals. So dopamine, that's the feel-good one, pleasure chemical. Serotonin, that's I'm feeling good in general, I feel connected to people. Oxytocin, that's the love chemical, I'm in love with you. So those three chemicals are the main three chemicals in the brain. All pleasure chemicals, all feel-good chemicals. And so what we realized is our brain was wired to function properly, to work properly, to develop properly when those three chemicals are operating. What happens with complex trauma? Those three chemicals don't operate at all. Rather, there's cortisol, opiates. And so what you find out is a child in constant danger, their ability to experience, or their actual experience of pleasure is very little. And they got all the wrong chemicals happening in their brain. So guess why drugs are effective? Finally, I get pleasure. Finally, I get what my brain was made for. And so synthetic, so just out of curiosity for you, so all drugs and alcohol release dopamine in the brain. So dopamine is the common chemical, and it's the pleasure. They've done, Dr. David Amen out of California, they've done brain imaging where they've measured dopamine released in the brain. So you sitting there right now would have 0. If you were to have your favorite meal today, it would release some dopamine. You go, oh, that was good. And so we would mark that and say that's 1. And then if you were to do your favorite activity, which for most people has a sexual component as far as pleasure, what we'd find is it would only double from the food, so it'd go to 2. So what you end up is from doing nothing to your most pleasurable activity, we end up with a graph that goes from 0 to 2. Guess what happens if you were to smoke crystal meth? It would jump to 12. So 6 times the pleasure that comes out of your most pleasurable activity. So somebody that's never experienced pleasure, you realize, yeah, that's pretty attractive to finally get to that. And so that's where drugs again becomes a solution to their problem. So we're wired for pleasure, and then we have physical needs, food, water. Then part of that physical is the sexual drive that develops. And then that kind of morphs into a procreation desire. I want to have my own family. And then we have relationship needs, and then love, emotional needs are all wrapped up here. So key thing I want you to understand. People with complex trauma had their physical needs met. Some didn't, but most did. The issue for them is number 4 and 5. Their emotional, relational needs. Nobody attached to them, connection. So attachment theory is providing huge insight into understanding complex trauma. They never felt like they belonged. They never had true intimacy. They never received genuine respect and value. They weren't nurtured, accepted for who they were. Core relationship or core emotional needs that weren't met. Now you can imagine if a child is not feeling accepted just because maybe they're a bit chubby and they're getting teased every day and mom's trying to put them on a diet every day, they're going to feel in danger every day. Am I going to come home and get teased again? Am I going to be laughed at again? Is mom going to give me another sermon and rant at me about my weight? And so just that one emotional need not met, of not being totally accepted for who they are, can create danger for them. Then we have a need for security, safety, so provision, protection, and that means we need a consistent environment in order to feel safe, and we need justice. What's one of the first words out of a child's mouth? That's not fair. We are wired for justice. And if we don't have justice, we don't feel safe. And so that's a massive need. And then purpose and significance. So they're finding in our Western culture where we have prosperity galore and kids have more toys than you could ever imagine, the number one thing kids are talking about today is, I wish I knew what I was here for. I wish I understood my purpose. So we have this need to feel like I'm here for something. And then we have the balance of work. We need to rest. We need to have times where the parasympathetic can balance out. So that's a need. We have a need for beauty. So we're drawn to art, we're drawn to travel, we're drawn to mountains and oceans. We love beauty. Beauty brings pleasure. It's an important part. And then awe. There's something in us that longs for a wow experience. So if you think of a child, the first time they ever see fireworks, their eyes are as big as saucers and it's wow. And then all the way home in the car, they talk a mile a minute about, wow, that was amazing. Can we go back tomorrow? Can we see that again? When's the next time? And then what you realize, if you took your child to see fireworks every day for a month, what would they be saying after 30 days of seeing fireworks every day? We got to do this again. This is boring. And so what you realize is to get the same wow, you need a bigger wow. We need a greater sensational, but we love sensational. And that's partly why extreme sports has become popular. People love that extreme wow stuff. And then there's the spiritual needs. So here's what I want you to understand. If one or more of those needs are not met, there's going to be something missing in your life. You may not consciously feel it, but you subconsciously are aware of it. It creates an emotional thirst, a physical thirst, a spiritual thirst. Something is missing and I have a thirst. And so, if my parents aren't helping me resolve that problem, so what does a child do when it has thirst? It cries, it asks for something. But if that need is not being met, then that thirst remains unresolved. So then guess what happens? The child goes and visits grandma, and grandma brings out this beautiful big bowl of chocolate ice cream. And they've never had chocolate ice cream before. And they eat it and they go, wow, that is good. That just solved all my emotional pain. I just found the solution to all my problems, chocolate ice cream. And you have a food addiction that just started because the child is trying to solve their pain with the first thing that gives pleasure. And then they hit their teen years and they have sex for the first time and they go, skip chocolate ice cream, I just found something better, and now they have a sex addiction. And so what I want you to realize is all of these unmet needs, when a child didn't get them met, it can create a hyper need, and when they get into adult life and they find the first thing that seems to meet that need, they become addicted to it. Shopping, buying, cutting, whatever will give me that pleasure to take that pain away. And so most of your addictions really are not chemical drug addictions. They're what we call process addictions, which is activities. Food, sex, gambling, shopping, the meeting of these needs with unhealthy things. And so that becomes, sadly, what many people in our culture are very aware of, but are never going to get help for. And in some cases, I grew up in an environment where food addiction, you actually got patted on the back for, wow, you can eat a lot of food. Yeah, wow, this is great. Come over and have more food. And so it was celebrated almost. So let me give you this. If you go into a church community, you're not going to see tons of people with drug and alcohol addiction, gambling addiction, but you're going to see people with food addiction and never talk about it. You're going to see people with sex addiction that aren't talking about it. The fastest growing addiction is internet porn, and that's huge. So what we have is all kinds of people with process addictions, but because it's not drugs, alcohol, they're thinking, oh, it's not that bad. The next thing I want you to see is drugs and alcohol. They take you downhill fast, and that's why we notice them and we have to stop and say, these people need help. Process addictions take you downhill slowly. And people say, I don't need help. I just got a bit of a bad habit here. It's not really affecting anybody. And it's not till their marriage and their families start falling apart that they start to say, maybe I need help. So what do we have to do then in helping people? So the path to healing is teaching people to meet all 12 of their needs. So recovery is not some magic bullet, just do this and you're fixed. Recovery is a reparenting process where I'm teaching you to meet your physical needs, your emotional needs, your intellectual needs, your relationship needs, your spiritual needs. That takes time. Okay, I'm going to give you one final thing, then we'll take a break. So a study was done about 4 years ago, which is fascinating to me. So most of us started riding a bicycle when we were about 5 years old. And so ever since we're 5, we've ridden our bicycle, turn the handlebars to the left, and our bike goes left. What they decided to do was they created a bicycle. When you turn the handlebars to the left, the bike went right. And they put people on. Now, in your brain, conceptually, within 1 second, you get, oh, okay, I get it. If I want to go right, turn left. I get the concept in 1 second. How long do you think it took them to actually be able to do it? A year. Now they could do it within 6 months as long as they were fully concentrating. Okay, I got to turn right. Okay, turn left. Okay, and if they could give 100% concentration. But then what they did is they bring somebody and start talking to them while they're riding. And guess what they went back to when somebody was talking to them? The old programming. And they went back to turn left to go left, and they crashed. And so what they realized is with complex trauma, you've got 20, 30, 40 years of bad programming in your subconscious brain that now you're asking people to change. You don't do that overnight. And you don't do that in a 12-week program. That takes 2 to 10 years. And so our medical model in the West is built on quick recovery times. Trauma model is long. And that's why it's been resisted. Because people are still wanting a quick fix, like the medical model. And what we're realizing with complex trauma, you're rewiring the brain. And it's really important to understand that as you work with people in complex trauma and your own complex trauma, is trauma never heals in an environment where you're not safe. Trauma only can heal when you're in safety. So people can't heal from trauma unless they're in safe relationships. If they're still in unsafe relationships, they can heal a little bit, but then they'll stop. They'll get stuck. Because safety is required to get healthy and to heal. That is so important to understand. So what that means is, for most people in trauma, is you aren't going to be able to heal unless you set boundaries with lack of safety. And that means unsafe people. But what do people with lots of shame issues? They don't like setting boundaries. They don't think they're worth it. They think people will get mad at them and not like them, and that messes up their shame. So setting boundaries to create safety is one of the most important but hardest things for people to do in early recovery. So this boundaries issue is massive but difficult because you're trying to create safety. So that is so important to understand. So safety is required if a person is going to get healthy. Okay, so what it's important to understand, there's 3 parts to healing. So get rid of the medical model in your mind, okay? So the medical model is you're in pain, you get a diagnosis, and then you either get one of three things. You get a surgery, you get a pill, or you get a therapy. But then within 6 to 12 weeks, you should be back to normal. Okay, so that's the medical model. That does not work with trauma. So you got to get rid of that. So the trauma model is really this. It's not linear. The medical model is a straight line. You start here, you do these steps, and you end up here. Straight line. Trauma model is not medical. So stage one is you create safety for the client. So that's why residential treatment centers are the best place initially for some, is because they can't create safety for themselves out there. And they can't set boundaries out there. They need you to do it for them. So a residents can do that. But the danger of that is you need to teach them to set boundaries for themselves. Otherwise, you institutionalize them. So now they can only do well when you're setting boundaries for them. As soon as they get out of a treatment center, they fall apart because they have never learned to set boundaries for themselves. So they only do well where others set boundaries for them and enforce them. So our job is this. We initially create safety, but then we give them the tools so they can create safety so they don't need us. So the worst thing we can do is make them dependent on us to continue to do the work that they should be doing. And that's where a lot of people go wrong. And what does a person who's in the helping field with their own shame? Well, they like having people dependent on them. It feels good. I'm needed. I'm valuable. Let's create dependence on me. Actually, you're enabling them to stay sick. And so it's really important to be able to be healthy enough yourself that you can parent people. And part of parenting is you want them to grow up so you can kick them out of the nest. So they can go and do it themselves. But you're teaching them the tools as you do it. But you provide it initially. So the first step, if a person is to heal, is safety. Second step, now we got to deal with the pain. Now we got to get some healing happening, because if we don't, that wound is going to get triggered and it's going to bleed all over your current relationships. So we need to begin to reprocess. Now this is tricky, and let me explain it. There's become a bit of an aversion when people hear that term, to reprocess memories, and that's because they misunderstand what is meant. So some people initially thought the way to heal trauma was just to get people to talk about it, as if that in and of itself would heal the trauma. And I go, no. The purpose of getting them to re-talk about it is not just to talk about it. That's important, but it's got to go beyond that. So you want them to re-talk about it so they can understand what happened, so they can understand the lies they believed as a result of that, the patterns that developed in their life that weren't healthy as a result of that, so they can change it. So the goal is to change it, but you got to start with talking about it and reprocessing it. Now, having said that, if I have somebody with severe sexual abuse, I don't in the first session say, let's talk about your sexual abuse, because that's probably going to be too much for them. So I can't get them talking about it till I give them the tools to handle talking about it. And that's part of the creating safety. So part of creating safety is not just boundaries, is I give you some agency, we call it, some tools, so that when we get to talk about the trauma, you're able to handle talking about it and processing it, so that now the processing of the trauma doesn't result in it remaining unresolved, but now for the first time when we process it, it can be resolved and you can heal and grow. So that's part 2. So you can see that's not going to happen on day 1. It's going to take a while to create safety, to create agency, but then you get to the reprocessing. Now here's where it gets tricky. You start reprocessing, and what's going to happen for some people? they go back to feeling unsafe. So guess what you have to do? You say, let's stop talking about this for a while. Let's go back and recreate safety. So all of a sudden, this is no longer a linear line. This is a zigzag line. We go forward, back, forward, back, forward, back. We go to trauma, unsafe, let's go back to safety for a while. Let's go back and reprocess. Then eventually we can get there. So you're back, forth, back, forth. We don't like that in Western culture. Number one, it's slow. Number one, it's messy. Number one, it doesn't have an end date. Where's the finish line in this product? Can you tell me by this date I'll be fixed? No. Well, what kind of therapist are you? That is the mindset. And so it's realizing we're so used to that linear medical model that has an end date that we get frustrated when there's not an end. Now the third thing is when a person gets to the point where they started to reprocess the trauma. So what I say to clients is this: you want to heal the trauma, you want to see what was unhealthy, then you want to learn healthy. And that means learning what healthy is and then the tools to get there. So that's what we're doing in the reprocessing of the trauma. Once they've learned the tools and they're starting to get healthy, they're healing. So the way I tell that with clients is they're still going to get triggered, but when they do get triggered, it's not going to be as intense, it's not going to last as long. They're going to regulate themselves more quickly. They're not going to be weeks beating themselves up, down on themselves, depressed. They're going to get through it in a few hours, in a day, and then they're going to resolve it. And so you're going to see that they're using the tools. Now here's what's critical. Remember, the brain processes bottom up. When they get triggered, they forget the tools they learned and they go back to old ones. And they go, oh, see, stupid me. It's like I never learned a thing. I forgot everything I ever learned. I'll never get this. And you go, no, whoa, 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 whoa. Your brain just went back to bottom up. Now let's stop and learn from this. So instead of beating yourself up, let's be compassionate. So here's the next thing. In order to create safety, you have to have a compassionate environment. You want to know what they found? They did 127 different questionnaires of people on what they thought brought lasting change. And do you know what they found in every single one of them? The most common response was, be hard on yourself. And do you want to know what they found? It never works long term. The people that had self-compassion and said, yeah, I didn't handle that well. Okay, let's be curious. Instead of beating myself up, what could I have done differently? Why did I act that way? Let's be compassionate to myself. Those are the people that had long-term change. The people that beat themselves up didn't. So here's critical. People to have safety, they need you to not be judgmental. So they come in and they go, oh, I'm sleeping with this person and I'm doing this and this is my sexual identity, and you're going, and you're getting ready to judge them. You're not going to help them. Take all of the judgment out, have compassion. But secondly, you've got to train them to have self-compassion. And what is shame's normal response? Inner critic, not inner compassion. And so what their brain is to always find fault with themselves, always beat themselves up, put themselves down. We have to retrain them to develop self-compassion if they're ever going to get healthy. So you're doing all of that, preparing them. Now you go, okay, this person is making progress. It's time for them to move on with life. So let's let them say, add a job to your life, add a relationship to your life, take on this volunteering thing, take on this hobby. You're starting to add responsibilities and pieces. And what's going to happen with that? They're going to get triggered. And what's going to happen when you get triggered? You got to go back to safety. Then you got to reprocess. Then you go back to moving. So another zigzag. So you had a zigzag happening at phase 2 where you had to go back to safety. Now at phase 3, you go back to a zigzag again. And so that's where people get frustrated. They go, but I thought I'd learned all this stuff by now. So here's what I want you to, key to understand is this. 90% of people with complex trauma they can heal, I would say, 70% of their stuff in a treatment program, where it's safe, where they're working with a therapist, where they're dealing with stuff. But what caused the deepest wounds in their soul? Intimate relationships. Mom and dad, the most intimate relationships of life. So what happens in a treatment center is you're working on all your wounds except your deepest wounds, because those are your intimate relationship wounds. And you're healing and growing all your other wounds, but your deep wounds aren't being triggered because you're not in an intimate relationship. So guess what happens when you go out and you get in an intimate relationship? Uh-oh, it just triggered my deepest wounds. And all of a sudden you go, it's like I never learned a thing in treatment. So what you realize is healing happens like layers of an onion. You deal with surface stuff, you deal with stuff with safe people, but once you get into intimate relationships, your deepest issues start coming up. And that's when the hardest part of healing and recovery can take place. And that could be months after you started, years after you started. And you go, this is one slow process. Yes, it is. But that's the reality. And so understand that often for clients, at the very beginning, you'll get very intense issues that come up and you go, wow, we're getting the good, heavy stuff. And you are. But then they'll do well for a while. But then they'll get in intimate relationship settings and all of a sudden this whole new bunch of deep, intense stuff comes up. And it's like, whoa, where did this come from? And so it's like they start intense, they get a break, and then they got to go intense again. And that can be discouraging for people, but that's the reality of them for their recovery. And so what I really want you to get is, I put sometimes on a whiteboard with clients, here's how we want recovery to go. And I draw a straight line that's always moving upward. Here's how recovery actually goes. But over 10 years, you see that it's moving upwards. But at times, it feels worse than it was a year ago. And it is, for a bit. But that's how messy and slow it is. Now, let me just again say this. To me, where I get frustrated is a lot of healthcare providers and Christians and churches still operate by a medical model. And they don't do it consciously, they do it subconsciously, but it comes out like this. Aren't you over that yet? Haven't you got victory in that area of your life yet? You're not a very good Christian. You're not doing it right. They do not want mess. They want it neat and tidy. And it's not possible with people from trauma. And unless as care providers we accept that, we're going to hurt people by setting a standard that says it's got to be neat and tidy. And we're going to cause them to feel worse. So what happens in dysfunctional families? Happens in institutions today, in caregiving and in churches. In dysfunctional families, in complex trauma families, if a kid is hurting, the dad doesn't say, I'm sorry, I didn't meet your need. The dad said, what'd you do wrong? It's your fault. What happens in churches and institutions today who still operate by the medical model and somebody's really struggling and continuing to fall? You're doing something wrong. Nobody wants to look at maybe we're doing something wrong or maybe we're not understanding this properly. We blame the person that they're not doing it fast enough. And so another way to say all of this is if you're working in this field, you got to have patience. You can't expect quick, magic, instant results. Now I need to add one little other piece with this. What's come out of the medical model is what I call magic solutions. Or another way to say that is bypassing. What's happened in a lot of Western churches because of that is what I call spiritual magic, spiritual bypassing. So you've got a problem, take a pill. That'll instantly fix you. Or you come into church, take a problem, you need Jesus, and he'll instantly fix you. It's magic. And we still want magic. And guess what addicts want? Guess what people who struggle want? Guess what people with trauma want? They want a magic fix. And they'll go running after anybody that promises a magic fix. And so what I realized when I started the programs was, if people are coming to me looking for magic, they're going to be disappointed. Because I'm going to tell them at the door, there's no magic fixes here. There's a lot of hard work, and there's a lot of working through pain. And if you're not prepared to do that, you're welcome to chase magic, but you're never going to find a solution in magic. And I've had people come back later and say, okay, I'm ready to work now because none of these magic things work. But it's realizing we work in an environment that still promises magic fixes. We know that are not true, but the clients don't. And they get sucked into it, and it breaks our heart to watch people chase after magic fixes. And I say to a lot of churches, shame on you for promising magic fixes. Next one, what I think are 5 important parts of understanding this. So there's a certain amount of healing from trauma that requires education. And so much of what we do is teach people the effects of trauma, much like I've taught you, how it affects you, your patterns, on and on and on. And so the greater the self-awareness, the greater you bring your subconscious to your conscious, the greater the healing. So healing begins with awareness. It's an academic thing. The danger is a lot of people want trauma healing to be all academic. They want it to be information only. And so there's 2 other parts. You can't heal from trauma unless you also go to your emotions. And they don't want to do that. You got to begin to feel. You got to heal those emotions. You got to learn to manage those emotions. So there's a therapy involved that takes you from the academic to the emotional world. But then there's a third part. You can't heal alone. You need connection. We're made for connection. You are made for healthy connection. And so I tell clients all the time, you can come into my program and you can learn all the material, but if you think just learning the material is going to make you healthy, you're wrong. You got to connect with the people in the program. You got to open up. You got to be vulnerable once you feel safe. You got to start to care again. That scares people to death who've been hurt by relationships, and complex trauma comes out of relationship. But you can't heal unless you address that fear and learn to connect again. So those are such important pieces. It's got to be an intellectual piece, an emotional piece, a connection piece. And then you're teaching them how to do that, giving them the tools. Because most people will say, I want to connect, I don't know how. Nobody ever connected with me, nobody gave me the tools. And so what most clients want is, can you give me tools so I can connect and have an intimate, deep friendship with somebody in one day? That satisfies their instant gratification brain. So I meet you, I like you, well, let's move in together. And you go, no, the building of intimacy is a long process. It takes sharing, it takes seeing each other in different circumstances. It takes working through conflicts. It's a 6 months, year before you really start to get to know a person. You just don't jump to instant intimacy. Well, then they go, you mean I got to sit here for a year lonely? I'm not doing that. I want an instant connection now. I go, well, okay. You got to live with a little bit of loneliness, but you can start to get partial growing connection. And that's quite satisfying. Or they go to, the only kind of connection they can think of is romantic, which is usually disastrous. And you go, no, let's start with non-romantic type connections to learn how to connect that doesn't include a romantic element. That's new territory for a lot of people because they've never done that before. So teaching them how to have relationships becomes a big part of this journey of healing, of recovery for them. And then the 5th one we've talked about, learning to manage the triggers that come up is a key part of this. Okay, other helpful tools, and this, so let me give you this. PTSD, the whole focus is what it's done in the limbic brain and the brain stem. So it's put them on high alert, the stress system's been activated, the memories are situated there, so they're going to get triggered, and they cause those responses that happen before the cortex is engaged. And so part of dealing with PTSD is also part of dealing with cptsd. You got to help people with learning to manage the triggers, the brain stem, and the limbic brain. That's a huge part of all of this. And so for a lot of people, when you look at treatment programs, what you end up finding is all the treatment programs basically being offered are really around learning to regulate. The early parts of recovery, getting your limbic and your brain stem healthier. They're not about what I would spend a lot of time on. What is unhealthy maladaptive behaviors? What does healthy look like? How do I learn to relate in healthy ways? How do I learn not to wear masks, to trust again, to not be a control freak, a perfectionist? Like, that's the kind of stuff they eventually have to get to, but you got to start by with the regulation stuff. So what they're finding is writing has a powerful effect, not for everybody, but for some. And so what you realize in a lot of these treatment modalities is they're very dependent on the person. What works for one doesn't necessarily work for another. And so be aware of that. But writing in a safe place, often it allows the person to feel it in their limbic brain, but switch in a safe place to their cortex so they can process it by writing. So it's interesting to me is that we speak about 130 words a minute. Do you know how fast we think? 13,000 words a minute. Or sorry, yeah, a minute. So we think way, way, way faster than we talk. But then if we choose to write, we have to write even slower than we talk. So what's happening when we write is the client is slowing their brain down so they can actually process at a deeper level. So that's the value for some. Brain spotting is similar to EMDR. So EMDR is a well-known, it's eye movement desensitization reprocessing. All it means is this. When you're working with a client around a memory, you get them to move their eyes from one side to the other. And what it does is it engages different parts of the brain. Brain spotting is the same thing. You follow a pointer the therapist is holding around a room until you find a part of the brain that has some trauma that needs to be dealt with. Okay? But what is happening in the EMDR is it's taking the trauma memory. So let me say this, and again, we're going to run out of time here. I don't know if you've ever dealt with trauma people who they can talk about their trauma, and it's like they're reading an encyclopedia. This happened, this happened, this happened. There's zero emotion. It's just an academic memory. Other people, when they talk about their trauma, it's nothing but emotion. They can't put any rational thought to it. And so what you realize is because of cortisol in the brain all the time, the one part of your brain manages emotions and emotional memories. The other part of your brain manages the intellect and the physical memories. There's a little thing called a corpus callosum that's in the middle. It's a little bridge. And it enables the two parts of the brain to join and link and blend the two, the emotions and the memories. What happens with cortisol when it's being pumped constantly is it burns up the corpus callosum. So now the two parts of your brains don't connect. So that's why you'll get some clients where they just remember the memories but zero emotion. Others have they have lots of emotions but zero memories. Or they just go to emotions all the time. So what's happening in EMDR is you're starting to connect the memories, the physical, the intellectual with the emotional. and helping them process the two together. Progressive muscle relaxation. If you've ever seen an animal that's been traumatized, that's really scared, and then they're finally through the trauma and they lie down, they tense up and they shake and then they relax. Guess what's happening? All the extra adrenaline and cortisol and tension is being released. So what they found for some people is it's very helpful to begin to give them muscle relaxing things where you tense everything up and then let it go. And it helps them release some of the pent up cortisol stuff. TRE is tapping. So you find the spots where the nerves meet and you tap on them, and they help your parasympathetic nervous system come in. And now we're getting into polyvagal theory, which is helping bring that parasympathetic nervous system. So all of these again are really trying to get the sympathetic, parasympathetic aligned. And what do you do when it's out of balance or you get re-triggered and it goes out of balance? Internal family systems is a lot around inner child stuff, and it's realizing that the child to survive had to fracture. So they developed an angry part that started to protect them. They developed a critical part that started to protect them. They developed a flirty part that started to protect them. All of these, they fractured to try to protect that hurting child. And so we call that protectors within internal family systems. And so it's important for a child, for the person as an adult to realize, I use my anger as a shield. I use my anger as a weapon. I use it to protect me, but to hurt people, it's not helping any relationship. I mean, do I need to give up my anger? That's scary, giving up my anger. Now what will I have to protect me? And so you begin to go through all the different parts you created to protect you to say, let's give them early retirement. Let's say you're no longer needed because I now have tools to protect myself. And you begin to integrate them back together to a whole person. So IFS has become very big. The biggest challenge, okay, I'm going to have to stop here. Let me go to here. So mindfulness and grounding become the two biggest big things to keep in mind in understanding. So grounding is my limbic brain gets triggered. How do I de-escalate it? How do I ground it and get it back so my cortex is online again? We're finding our wonderful grounding things that help people begin to get their limbic brain calmed down, their parasympathetic working again. Such an important thing. Mindfulness is what I do in the rest of my life to get healthier. So I need to become mindful of me. I need to become more self-aware. So if I've been emotionally disconnected all of my life, maybe when I wake up in the morning, I need to go, what emotions am I feeling right now? And you go, I don't know. I've never thought of that before. But I start to become aware, and then you go, wow, I'm angry, I'm stressed out, I'm full of anxiety. I'm not in a good headspace. Then the next step of mindfulness is, okay, what am I going to do about it? Well, I'm going to do some meditation, some prayer, some reading. I'm going to talk to somebody. Oh, okay, good. I'm building now a routine of healthy things that help me stay in a good headspace, that help me identify when I'm not in a good headspace, so that I'm learning how to live a healthy life. I'm learning how to deal with emotions. I'm learning how to be aware. I'm learning tools for dealing with all of that stuff. So mindfulness becomes such an important part. So mindfulness, again, has often been misunderstood as just meditation. It's way bigger than that. It's got meditation and other disciplines as a part of what helps me stay in headspace, but it's all about self-awareness and learning tools to get a healthier life. So those are huge. And so what you're going to find for most clients is the biggest challenge for them is 97% of the time they're in their cortex. And they make good decisions in their cortex. They're a mature adult in their cortex. They're a loving parent in their cortex. It's the 3% when they get triggered and in their limbic brain. And then they are the devil in shoes. And they do a ton of damage. So what I want clients to realize is this: 97% of your time you're constructive. 3% you're destructive. It's in the 3% you do all the damage. But guess what the hardest part of healing and learning tools is? The 3%. And so helping people learn to deal with their limbic brain is one of the most important part that we teach them, because that's where all the damage gets done, is when they go into that limbic brain. So DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, has been developed to help people manage their limbic brain, get back into their cortex, into their wise mind. CBT has done a bit of work, cognitive behavior therapy, around that. There's all kinds of different modalities out there today. But the bottom line is most of those are early in recovery stuff. They eventually got to get to learning how to live a healthy life. And that's the bulk of the work that we do once we get them to that safe place. Okay, we got 15 minutes. We're going to get through as many questions as we can.
What was the therapy to get from the limbic to the conscious?
So dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT. So it's designed by Marsha Linehan. And basically dialectic means two opposing forces inside of you. And so what you find because of complex trauma is your cortex wants to act one way, your limbic wants to act a totally different way. And so now you got a war in your brain. I want to do two different opposing things. And so I can't let my limbic brain run the show and be in the driver's seat, because I'm going to make bad decisions. So how do I get it out of the driver's seat and back to the cortex being the manager of my body? That's what DBT is about.
The association between, you mentioned drugs, and when you mentioned drugs, you were talking about the serotonin and the dopamine that kind of either numbs the pain and then it helps to produce
Right.
those other chemicals. But when someone goes through the medical form, you said, they are prescribed prescription drugs. It's the same process.
Not necessarily. Right. Well, let me explain it. So let me say a couple things. So all drugs and alcohol, dopamine is common, but some have also serotonin. So ecstasy is serotonin. So there's different chemicals that are part of different drugs which create different things. Those are what we call your stimulant drugs. So crack, cocaine, crystal meth, all your stimulant drugs. We even give ADH medication, which is actually a stimulant drug. So all of that. But then you have your depressant drugs. They still have dopamine, but they now have the opioids, the opiates. So that's your fentanyl, your morphine, your heroin. All of those are now your opiate drugs. So again, it appeals to different people. So the people that have basically had complex trauma where they've got fight-flight is their normal way, they love stimulant drugs because it just keeps feeding into that. The people that had to go to freeze and the body had to produce its own opioids, they love opiate drugs because it keeps them in that dissociated state, that numb state, that fairyland state. And it's almost a sexual orgasmic thing for them. It's that warm blanket around them that is there. What's interesting is this. A lot of people don't understand, why do young girls or guys cut? Guess what happens when you cut? It releases opioids in the brain. It creates the same fuzzy feeling. And so for them, cutting is a drug. It's a solution to take the pain away. And so when the focus of a person's life is pain, 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 they're drawn to opioids. When their purpose is empty, or when their focus is emptiness, with some pain as part of that, but emptiness, they're drawn to stimulants. Because that's going to make me alive again. That's going to make everything exciting again. Does that answer your question? Oh, okay.
Okay, so I know that.
Okay.
But now, what's the connection between the medical,
Oh, okay, yes, thank you.
medication?
Right. So if you are in physical pain, so you've been cut, you've had surgery, and they give you morphine, your brain uses it to patch up the physical pain. Once the wound is healed, you no longer have the pain, you no longer need morphine, and so you have no withdrawal symptoms. Because you didn't develop a dependence on it because you needed it. What happens when you have an emotional pain that you try to medicate, and you do it by just pumping drugs in, your brain is adjusting because it's saying this is more opioids than I'm used to, or this is more dopamine than I need. So it actually changes its chemical makeup. So what happens now is the amount of cocaine that gave me a high yesterday doesn't give me a high today. I need more cocaine because my chemical makeup has changed. The amount of morphine that it gave me a high yesterday doesn't do it today, so I need more morphine. So the brain is changing, it's adapting to survive because it's way too much opioids, way too much dopamine. So you're changing your brain by continuing down the road of addiction into more and more drug use. But it's all over emotional pain. Your body doesn't need it. So now when you quit, your brain says, no, I need this. Now I got to have it. So you have withdrawal, you have the shakes, the DTs, all of those things. And it takes a week for the brain to start to get back to the right chemical, but it takes up to a year for the dopamine system to reset in the brain and the opioid system. And so it takes a year of going through abstinence to get the brain back to its normal chemical makeup. Now the trick with all of that is, let's say 5 years later, you picked up some fentanyl, the brain goes, okay, this is more fentanyl than I need. Oh, I know what to do with that. And it within 1 day changes back to that old chemical composition. And now you're hooked again. And so that is why people who, once the brain's changed chemically and they're truly addicted, abstinence is their only solution. They can't go back to partial using because the brain just goes back to that original chemical. Antidepressants, you're getting into a bit of a gray area. It's a different thing. It's working on very different receptors in the brain, and that becomes important to understand. But addicts will abuse antidepressants. And so an addict will find something that changes the brain chemical, even the littlest degree, and they will find a way to abuse it. And so, again, there's all kinds of new research coming out around depression and is it genetic versus is it trauma, and there's a real shift starting to happen that I think is going to really threaten the antidepressant industry. But at this point, the main schools of thought are still saying most of the depression comes out of trauma, but it did change the brain, and sometimes a person needs some medical help in order to help the receptors. And so that's kind of where I would be at this point with that. So does that help? Okay. Yes.
So I was focusing in on a couple slides back where we talked about having a surrogate family. Usually families are not in a relationship for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. It's kind of like a long haul. How do you feel about getting into a relationship with people who are on this journey, knowing that you're not going to be, you can't be with them either 24/7 or for like weeks and months in the future? Do you feel that you're kind of leading them, stringing them along and then dropping them, or how do you manage that commitment?
So I would say one way to understand a healthy family is at infancy you are at total dependence, and so there's very few boundaries with the baby. If you cry, I'm coming, I'm going to do whatever you need, I'm going to feed you, do everything for you. But the goal of parenting in a family life is not that that child stays at that state. So parenting and healthy family life is recognizing as a child gets bigger and grows, I push the boundary out. So they're less dependent on me, but I've given them tools so they can learn to meet their own needs. So that eventually at 18, 20, 25, I can say, see you later, have a good life, you're ready to go get married and have your own family. So all family life is pushing out boundaries to independence. So what I tell clients is this, what I'm going to do with you is I'm going to take a 20-year period of parenting and I'm going to compress it to a year. And I'm going to let you really close, but I'm going to start to quickly push you out because you can learn tools a lot faster at your age because you've already got some life experience. You're not going to like it. You're going to feel like I'm rejecting you. You're going to feel like I'm abandoning you, but I'm not. I'm helping you grow up. But I'm going to push you to use the tools I teach you, which means making you more independent, less needing me. Now, I'm still going to let you talk to me, but I'm not going to let you lean on me. So it's a sped up process of growing up so that when you get to that end of the year, I can say, you know what, I'm going to give my time more intensely to other people, but I'm still going to check in with you once a week, just like I would with my adult children. How are you doing this week? What's going on? So that we develop that kind of family relationship. Does that help?
Yeah, so would you encourage teams around the individual? Because a family's not just composed
Exactly.
of siblings or a mother or a father. You have the whole team range.
Exactly. And I think the more you're able to offer multiple people as the family, the better. It's just in some cases you can't, but that's the ideal. Yeah.
How do you go forward to, as I'm a pastor, I want to be able to use some of these tools. I don't want to go to university or I don't, but I want to be able to use some of these tools as I deal with my congregation. How do I learn? Where can I go?
Start on our...
Reading, of course.
So let me go to this here. Go to the website. I would encourage all of you, whether you think you have trauma or not, I would encourage all of you to take our LIFT program. I think our LIFT program is our online program. It's 15 weeks. It only requires an hour and a half a day. So we have a daytime at lunch, we have an afternoon, and we have an evening option for people. You are going to, in that time, you're going to watch a video of me every day. I'll just warn you of that, where you're going to learn about shame, boundaries, grieving, complex trauma, all kinds of different stuff. Then you're going to have a group setting where you're connecting with other people through Zoom. But it's an amazing healing journey for people and growth journey. And you are going to learn so much about yourself, so much about helping people, that I think all of you would find it worthwhile. I just wish everybody would do it. It's a journey of self-discovery. If you can't do that, then you can go on the YouTube and just watch some videos. I've got a church right now in Windsor that's approached me to say, would you come once a month on a Friday night and teach our church complex trauma? And we want to bring all the volunteers in. We want to invite anybody that wants to come in. And so we want to start a one-year journey where once a month we just get a little bit more teaching about complex trauma. So I've agreed to do that. Not sure I'm going to fit in my schedule, but I'm going to do it. But that kind of thing you could do just by using our videos, is to show your church once a week, once a month, we're going to have this video. Usually what you have to do with the church is take it outside of complex trauma, because 90% of people go, I don't have trauma, what's that got to do with me? So you got to be able to sell it in a way that draws them in. And that's why I use the 60 characteristics. You have control issues, perfectionist, people pleasing. Oh yeah, okay, well then come to this and I'll help you. So those kind of options are available and we can talk more about that. Okay, final question.
Yeah, further to that topic, I'd like to ask that question or hear your response in the opposite way.
how can we as followers of Jesus Christ be authentic in our relationship with God first, Jesus first, Christ-centered, and package what you're proposing and what you're saying in a way that we can have integrity and clarity in what the Word of God says about our life.
Yep, excellent question. Let me give you this. I'm glad we're ending with this because it's key. If you want to understand, if you were to talk to, like I deal with thousands of clients a year, but if you were to talk to all of them, I would say 90% of them would say that they grew up in a home, Christian home or not, where they never felt totally understood. Another way to say that is their parents wanted them to be where their parents were at. Their parents didn't want to take the time to understand where they were at. That is key to me when it comes to recovery, because what a lot of churches do is say, if we're going to have integrity, we got to get you to Jesus right now. We got to get you to know what we believe about that right now. And I go, no, you don't. You got to meet them where they're at and understand where they're at and accept them where they're at. Then you can move them along, but don't try to get them to where you're at. That's narcissistic, complex trauma fathering. Our goal is first to understand them and get them before we can ever help them. So that's where we got to start, is listening, not talking. And so I think if churches could ever get that, because the fear is, well, then we're not loyal to God. Then we're missing part of the message. Who says you got to give all the message in the first day? Let's start with understanding them and hearing them before we even open our mouth to give a message. And so much of complex trauma has been parents who want to be heard more than want to hear. And we got to change that message for people. And that's tough, because that gets a lot of people. Okay. Lunch is ready, right? Okay, I'll do you while they're checking.
What about cigarette smoking? What is that addiction involved in?
So your brain actually has a nicotine receptor, and it helps with stress. So it's a stress reducer. So for people with nicotine, it's for them, it helps them calm down. But the problem is, once your brain gets used to it, then you need more cigarettes to get the same effect. So it doesn't deal. So any addiction, once you put more into the brain than it desires, the brain's got to change chemically, and then you need more of that thing to get the same effect. So that's why it becomes addiction. So for most people, I never make a big deal out of smoking. 90% of addicts smoke. It's just part of what they do. And to me, that's not their main issue right now. Let's get on to other stuff, and let's not start making big deals out of all of those things. They'll get to that eventually on their own time. Yeah. Well, it really operates like a lot of addictions. It's built off of natural things in our brain that we need. So the hardest addictions to deal with are food and sex. Why? Because we're wired to need them. Our brain produces chemicals to want them. And so what happens with sex and food addiction is you mistrain that whole system so it no longer satisfies and you need more and more, or it's trying to meet an emotional need that it wasn't intended to meet. And so to retrain that whole system, well, you can't say be abstinent. You still got to eat. Well, you have to learn to distinguish between healthy eating and unhealthy eating. Ooh, that's hard, because you still got to eat, and every time you eat, it wants to cross over into unhealthy. And so what you find with nicotine is your brain has receptors wanting that, and so it's going to take a long time. There's not a quick fix. And I think for many people that have gone cold turkey, good for them. Not many have done it. And I get so frustrated when I hear people say, I gave up my addiction in a day and I've never gone back. And I go, good for you. And I never had to go to a program. And I go, good for you. You're in about 1% percentile. 99% couldn't give it up in a day, first crack. 99% had to go through a program. So just because you're the exception, don't try to make yourself the rule. And I think the same is true as smoking, is 90-some% of people, it takes about 13 years, they found out, for the average person to quit smoking. And we don't like to hear that. Okay, keep seeing hands, but I know lunch is ready.
David's right there.
Okay.
First off, thanks y'all for coming. Whoever doesn't know me, I'm David Rashawn. I work at the Sally next door. I also have a food company and a nonprofit. The food company is Kanoki Foods. The nonprofit is Use Matter Incorporated that you saw on the flyer. So Kanoki Foods is just to raise money to be able to help people with complex trauma. I had ideas about like having a farm and all that. We do want that eventually, but as I went through and started training with Tim, I learned that I needed to like go slower about things. So that's why want to talk to y'all about En Route. En Route, like he said, will be the first modules, and it's a lot easier. It's easier to license. There's less people have to be involved, and a lot of y'all with organizations and churches, and we are looking for places. We would like to eventually have enough volunteers to have 5 of them around town, so we can have a React center that they can go into. And you guys are from different organizations, so we're going to have to work with the housing organization. We're going to have to work with a lot of things for people to do React. So we can start off by helping them get light a fire under their ass for the stages of change. Excuse my language, but that's what React's going to do. You're going to see things, you're going to understand things, you're going to be like, I think now I can change. En Route will do that. React is real deep. So we will work with MASH, we'll work with Womankind to get people some detox. We will work with to get them a place to go so they can come every day and do the React. It's 3 hours a day, 5 days a week. But until then, we need places and people to help us organize small groups of En Route to help folks get the stages of change fired up. And now we're about to eat. We got chili cheese Fritos. You got the Fritos, you can put the chili on it, and then we got all the fixings for it. I thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
So that was the seminar, and I'm sorry that we weren't able to get everything that Tim touched on. We did because of our technical difficulties, but Tim Fletcher has a YouTube channel that has hundreds of videos on it. If you just go on YouTube and search Tim Fletcher Complex Trauma, it'll come up right with his channel, which is self-titled Tim Fletcher. You can go to timfletcher.ca, which you can find out about all the programs on there. If you are in another town, anywhere across the world, and you would like to start an En Route or a React, contact Tim Fletcher through the website. His organization will get back with you. They'll help you with whatever you do, whatever training. All is online training. If you're in Hamilton, you can get a hold of me at Use Matter, yousmatter.905@gmail.com. There's also going to be a link on this video that you can get a hold of us. We're looking for volunteers. We're looking for people to train. We're looking for places to have the En Routes. We would like to, in the next 12 months, we'd like to have 5 drop-ins. And then at the end of 12 months, hopefully we'll be able to start doing what we got to do to have a React. We will need volunteers. We'll need people who are willing to sponsor people to do the online program Lift until we get React, because there's also basically a React online. It's called Lift. It's great. It's 5 days or 3 days a week, depending on the person's what they can do. But you can just follow any of the links, or just go to timfletcher.ca and find out everything you need to know. Thank you. Again, my name is Kanoki Dave, and thank you for everyone who came out.